Hi. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here. I'm Paul Kedrosky. I'm with the Kauffman Foundation. I don't know how many folks in the room know the Kauffman Foundation. Is it fairly well? Oh, that's good. Usually when I come to San Jose or San Francisco, the Bay Area in general, I usually have to immediately disabuse people of ideas of what exactly the Kauffman Foundation is, because they right away say, oh, I met someone from the Kauffman Foundation. They were a Kauffman fellow. They worked at such and such a venture capital firm. So in the Bay Area, almost 15 years ago, we seeded a program to train next generation of venture capitalists, and we spun it out, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the Kauffman Foundation anymore. It just so happens that it's called a Kauffman Fellows Program. It still exists. It's still cheerfully going on, seeding and helping to train new venture capitalists, but it has nothing to do with the Kauffman Foundation anymore. So usually when I come here, the first people think of are the Kauffman Foundation Fellows. And just to make things even more confusing, we actually have fellows at the Kauffman Foundation who are completely unrelated to the Kauffman Fellows who are in the Bay Area. So it's as if we've got some kind of strange witness protection program going on where we're trying to confuse the crap out of people. I'm not really sure what's going on. Nevertheless, so the Kauffman Foundation, I'll just give a really quick background, and then I was going to talk about some programs where there's some synergies in terms of some things that I think SRII is doing and some of the things we're interested in. So the Kauffman Foundation is the largest foundation in the world devoted to entrepreneurship and economic growth. It's located in Kansas City. I'm in Southern California. I'm down in San Diego. The foundation itself now has about $2 billion as an endowment, and out of that we use the proceeds from that endowment for two purposes. One is to drive research programs related to entrepreneurship, innovation, and economic growth. And we have probably 15 or 20 researchers in Kansas City and spread throughout the country and a few others in other locations who are actively pushing that agenda using the monies that are generated from that endowment. And at the same time, we also fund a whole set of direct programs in everything from K-12 education to entrepreneurship programs to university-based research programs. We're probably, last year anyways, we were probably the largest single non-governmental funder of entrepreneurship and certainly possibly even economic research in the United States. We're very active funders of research in general. We can talk about what we get out of that and whether we like it or not. That's a conversation for another day. And then the other side of the house is we have this large endowment, proceeds from which have to be invested actively to generate the returns that allow us to do the kinds of things we like to do. And we invest very much as a for-profit investor. We're a direct investor in everything from physical assets ranging across the board to directly in equities, hedge funds. We're probably one of the most active LPs in venture capital funds in the United States with something like 35 or 38 LP interests, meaning we're a limited partner in something like that many different venture funds. So there's really sort of the two sides to the shop, and all of which gets funded by what we do on the endowment side. So that gives you a quick context for the Kauffman Foundation. Been around since the late 1970s now, funded by Ewing Marion Kauffman, who was an entrepreneur in medical devices, whose company was sold to Boston Scientific, and as a result, it was a company called Marion Labs. And as the proceeds from that investment, he used to create this foundation to try and help entrepreneurs like himself going forward. And that was the idea. So we have a host of different programs going on. One of the most active right now that's really global in its outlook, and we're talking a lot about it, and I'm spending a lot of time on, is this relationship between entrepreneurship, innovation, economic growth in cities. It's one of our most active areas. We sort of been talking about this endlessly, spent a lot of time with the TED folks this year. It became one of the big themes of the TED conference this year here in Long Beach. So I'll talk a little bit about it. And we can talk some more if you're interested. It's sort of just to set some context. There's been pretty dramatic changes in terms of how we live. In terms of the innovations we see inside of our own homes, leaving how we organize the way we live and how that drives innovation. Look at 1940 versus 2010 from some BLS graphics. What we paid in rent, 80% of U.S. households had an outside toilet, rural farms, 18% had running water. All of these things now completely flip-flopped over the last 50, 60 years. It's really dramatic changes that happened in the span of certainly less than the span of a single human lifetime. These dramatic changes in how we live and where we live. So it's worthwhile sort of putting that in context. There have been very dramatic dramatic shifts in terms of, this is a very US-centric presentation. I can do a sort of a different twist on this if we talk outside the US, but it's worthwhile just for the purposes of this to stay a little bit more US-centric. There's been big shifts in terms of both the economic weight and the population weight of cities around the United States, even over the last 30 years. Certainly some of the largest cities have stayed very much in place, but if you look at the decline, for example, in cities like Philadelphia or Detroit, these are very precipitous changes, aren't they? Not just in terms of population, but probably more importantly, at least from our standpoint, as we think about these as potential hubs for entrepreneurship and innovation, as viable economic entities, right? As truly remarkable changes, unprecedented in terms of the pace at which we've seen both the declines and the advances. I mean, if it's rather than getting preoccupied with what's happened in Detroit, look at, for example, Phoenix, which in 1978 on a GDP basis has soared from around 28th place to something like 13th, again, in this very, very short time frame. So that's one of the lenses we like to bring to bear, sort of thinking of cities almost as small countries, right, as sort of GDP driving economic entities, and the role of entrepreneurs and innovation therein. Another lens we bring to bear as we sort of think about this whole subject of cities is characterizing patents. So this is a measure. Perversely enough, the reds and blues are reversed. I don't know why that was done this way, but nevertheless, this is from some work at the Santa Fe Institute, looking at comparing sort of what we would expect in terms of patent intensity in various regions around the United States and whether we're producing more or less patents per capita in those cities. Red, and the size of the red denotes producing more than you would expect, not less. It's actually it's somewhat reversed. So if you're colorblind, this probably looks fantastic. And blue is the reverse. Blue is the underproduction. So you can see the regions that sort of punch above their weight, to use the expression, that do better than you might expect, and the regions that do somewhat less than you might expect. So again, not to suggest, because we're not in the camp saying that patent production is neither sort of necessary nor sufficient in terms of driving innovation, but it is a precursor among many precursors to some forms of innovation. So it's worth looking at that. So it's another measure as we sort of been building out our research program in this area, and we think about economic growth and entrepreneurship and innovation. We look at patent intensity as we move around. We also spent a lot of time thinking about the impact of the recent housing collapse in the United States. It's had a fairly remarkable impact, and I'll talk about it as we go on in terms of some of the core characteristics of the U.S. So some cities with some of the, obviously some of the most exuberant construction booms have seen, the steepest price declines. You can kind of cluster it out and look at what's happened in some of the bubble cities, which are denoted in red here. This is a McKinsey figure, actually. And then look what's happened in the rest of the country. While the housing collapse in the United States was fairly widespread, it was most dramatic, obviously, in some of the regions up in the top right. And that has some huge implications in terms of the propensity for sort of entrepreneurial activity in the U.S. Similarly, some cities in the United States have grown much faster than you might expect, given sort of the composition of their sectors, right? So we might have expected some of the hottest tech-driven cities to be some of the fastest growing cities in the United States, and that's not been the case. So some of the most entrepreneurial, vibrant cities in the U.S., that hasn't correlated with being among the fastest growing in population terms. The fastest growing in population terms have largely been spread through the Sun Belt, and the fastest decliners have been largely spread through the Rust Belt, euphemistically called in both cases. And yet some of the most entrepreneurially vibrant cities, as we might characterize them, are sort of in a slice down the middle. Certainly New York, possibly San Diego. This is the Bay Area is a good example. Seattle, Austin. All of these are some of the most entrepreneurial vibrant areas. So it's worth keeping in mind, again, that one of the things that's flowing from this work is sort of a rethinking of the role or the relationship between being more entrepreneurial active and what's happening in terms of the economic growth of the city. So to take some truly unusual looks at things, and I'm in debt to sort of NASA and Rich Florida of creative class fame for some of this stuff. Another lens we like to bring to bear is thinking about energy intensity, and one of the more interesting recent measures that you see that's being brought to bear a lot more often as you think about energy intensity of cities, and I'll just flip through a couple of these, is lighting from space, looking at cities at nighttime. This is the San Jose area at night, taken 8 years ago. This is the border with Mexico between El Paso and Ciudad de Juarez, just sort of out east, well east of San Diego in Texas. Looking at, you can actually see the border split and the light intensity and even the intensity of economic development on either side of the border. These sorts of measures are interesting proxies for economic growth. Similarly, so we can see sort of the suburban sprawl between Jeddah and Mecca here in Saudi Arabia, looking at the extension across here. We're looking at some of these measures. And obviously, you see the same phenomena on a global basis in terms of economic, and there's some wonderful papers on this subject, looking at changing economic intensity over time as proxied by light emissions at night. Again, trying to find ways to get outside. One of our programs here is to try and get outside the orthodox economic data, not get trapped in what regional governments and governments are presenting, because oftentimes they're presenting data that's directly for their own purposes, or it's even potentially completely muddled, or is closer to propaganda than actual economic data. So we're trying to get outside the trap of relying on that sort of thing. So we look a lot at that. We look a lot at flows. There's a long history of looking at economic flows. This is the first one that we could find when we were first looking at this. This is looking at population flows in the Dublin area from a very early paper, 1837, looking at how much traffic flows into and out of the city along various major arteries. But we've taken that considerably further forward. So this is looking at population flows into and out of, and I'll flip through a couple of these just because they're so much fun. This is looking at population flows into and out of Santa Clara County, which is right here where we are, San Jose, dating back over the last 5 years to 2005. The data ends in 2010. There's a more recent version of this coming in 2011. And so the way to look at it, the blue bars here are the inbound migration, people coming into these regions in each of the calendar years. And the red data shows outbound migration, people leaving the area of interest in the period in question. So what's pretty remarkable that you can see here is that, among other things, so this particular region draws from and sends to people all over the country, but in particular it draws from and sends people to coastal regions. That's really interesting. Something else that's very interesting, if you look through the time series of data up in the top right, 2005 through 2007 or 10, what should jump out at you is this notion of, and we call it flux, this idea that some of the most entrepreneurially vibrant regions have a high degree of flux, meaning that mayors and city councilors and others have this, attachment to the idea that they really want to grow the population. We don't want people to leave. We need to create jobs for people who are here. And as we rethink economic growth in cities with sort of an entrepreneurial and innovation lens on, what you realize is that cities are kind of biological sorting mechanisms, right? People find things that are interesting for them, and if they don't, they leave. And people, as the opportunities change, the population of your city resorts itself accordingly. And that's not to be sort of deterministic or even blithe about what's happening, but nevertheless, it's important to realize that in many of the most entrepreneurially vibrant parts of the United States, even during the periods of their highest degrees of vibrancy, there was no net inflow. As a matter of fact, many of these regions were actually declining in population as they were demonstrating some of the highest degrees of entrepreneurial vibrancy of anywhere in the world. And that's really remarkable. As I sort of traveled around, I was in Spain recently talking about this, and we were having almost this completely reverse conversation where it was all about how do we keep people here? We need to keep people here and bring more. We need to keep people here and bring more. And I was trying to get a conversation going about this notion of flux, this idea that really it's all about allowing areas to resort themselves as the opportunities change and try and create the most porous membrane possible for people to flow into and out of the region. This is another example of the same sort of phenomenon, using Jackson County, which is Kansas City, where the Kauffman Foundation is, as an example. Not nearly as much activity going on as measured either way that you might look at it in terms of sort of the raw numbers themselves or where they draw from. But nevertheless, a certain amount of flux going on here, inbound and outbound migration dominating inbound migration, which at least is positive for the most part over the period. This incredible emergence of Boulder. Boulder has been this great story over the last decade, really, in terms of its emergence as an entrepreneurial hotbed in the United States. And what's really interesting to see as you look at this figure is you can sort of see it happening as you track the data across from 25 to 2010. So Boulder is part of Boulder County. It's the dominant population center in the region. Look at where it's drawing from. It draws from, compare this again, go back a slide for a second. Compare where it draws from and where Kansas City draws from. Many of the same areas, but also a lot more regional drawing. Boulder drawing from far more parts of the country, which is one of the signs of sort of economic and entrepreneurial vitality in terms of a region. Now let's go to the exact opposite example. Have a look at Detroit. So this is Detroit over the same period, Wayne County, which again, the biggest population center is Detroit. Have a look what's happening here. This is unprecedented in the U.S. in terms of recent economic history. We'd have to go back to sort of the period after the Civil War to see this kind of hollowing out of a region. So what's happening? This incredible outbound migration. This is not healthy flux. This is very unhealthy flux from the standpoint of the city, because it's hollowing out even faster than the city can sort of reassemble itself. And people are heading out all over the country, but certainly the dominant trend is this incredible outbound migration. And it's been going on for years, but it's accelerating. Why does all of this matter? Why does all this flux and this sorting and this change matter? I'll start off at a high level talking about it, but one of the characteristics of the US that makes it different from many other countries in the world, and it's shown up in data for a long, long time, is this incredible level of mobility, geographic mobility. It is among the most mobile societies in the world in terms of the likelihood of someone having moved within the last 3 to 5 years. This country is among the most mobile in the world. Despite its size, despite the opportunities in any particular region, there's an incredible propensity for people to move, to constantly say, you know what, opportunities aren't so great here, I'm going to move to Atlanta, then I'm going to move to Dallas, and then I'm going to move to Seattle. You talk to people, and it's the story you hear over and over again, this incredible mobility. Well, mobility plays into this discussion, doesn't it? Because it's this notion of almost biological resorting, opportunities finding them appearing and people finding those opportunities as they relocate around the country. Well, now look what's happened. In the 1950s and 60s, 1 in 5 Americans changed residences every year. Every year, 1 in 5 Americans changed residences. It's a staggering number, leading the world. Now look what's happened as we get closer to the current period, 2007, 2008, 2009. We've gone well below the long-run average of 18%. We dropped to around 1 in 10, and the most recent data shows it's even lower. Well, what's happening? Is it that people are just so darn happy where they live that they don't want to move anywhere else anymore? No. What is happening? Well, it's partly to do with the economic situation in the U.S. in recent years. There haven't been as many opportunities people feel like they needed to move for, but it's also the changing nature of the housing market. Many people feel trapped inside their own homes in this country, unable to get out from underneath their mortgage, whether by refinancing or actually selling the thing, which is the second option, obviously being more ideal if you're leaving. They can't move. If you can't get out from underneath your mortgage obligation, you can't go anywhere. So this great weight sitting on top of mobility, which in turn drives economic growth, which in turn drives innovation in the United States, so they at least work together. Sitting on top of it all has been this declining mobility in the U.S. This is a remarkable figure, I think, and one that's incredibly important as you think about your own countries, your own regions, your own problems, as you think about different regions and driving economic growth. Mobility is so important because it drives this shuffling, it drives this resorting. You know, there's a great series of studies done that Anna Marie Saxenian up at Berkeley has done talking about the role of alienation in driving innovation and driving economic growth. One of the reasons why people came out to California and were so willing to take risks that they wouldn't take in other parts of the country was because they didn't know anyone. Right? What difference does it make if I fail? I don't know anybody here. Nobody here knows me. I can come here and fail with impunity. We oversell this idea that people are, expected to fail in California. It's become sort of almost a cliche. But there's an element of it that's really important, and the element of it is this notion of mobility, where people move, find a place where they can fail with impunity inside of a new community, where they don't have to worry about going to the grocery store, running into their aunt and uncle, and having them say, hey, how come you're not a doctor? I thought you were going to go through school and be a doctor. What are you doing messing around with this software stuff? It was a story I heard all the time when I was in Madrid recently, where there was one of the problems they had was this feeling that people couldn't really escape the orbit of their own family connections. There was this constant pressure to conform to whatever the expectations were of your family unit. And one of the things that's remarkable about California, less so now than 50 years ago, because you're not actually gone when you're on Facebook and Twitter all the time, it just feels like you're gone, is that this notion you could escape the circles of conformity that are created by having to live up to the pressures created by your own family unit. So mobility is hugely important, and mobility in the United States is collapsing, and that's having dramatic consequences. One of the reasons why we don't do a lot of policy work, but we do spend time in Washington, and it's one of the reasons why we've been really pushing hard on the idea that we need to rethink how important mobility is, and think about solutions to the mortgage problems in the United States, not from an straight up economic mortgage and lending standpoint, because it's a driver of economic growth by allowing people to become mobile again. It brings a totally different perspective driven by cities. So much of what happens in the US and around the world in terms of driving economic growth is about mobility, but not just mobility in terms of me going different places, but my ability to connect to different people. I often joke that the dirty secret of Silicon Valley, the reason why Silicon Valley works in Silicon Valley and doesn't really work anywhere else in the world, and God knows we've tried, right? We've tried everywhere to clone Silicon Valley. And one of the reasons why it works here is because its dirty secret is standout successes can be sold anywhere in the world, right? A Skype can happen anywhere in the world and get sold for giant numbers. Pick your favorite success. But it's the mid-market companies, the companies that have a few million in revenues and get sold for 20 times revenues or some absurd number, create a bunch of moneyed entrepreneurs who in turn channel that money back into the marketplace. How do you make that happen, right? How does that happen? Well, that happens because of the Valley's dirty secret. And the Valley's dirty secret is that so many of the entrepreneurial successes here are, and we won't tell anyone outside this room, it's friends selling to friends. It's friends selling to friends. He said, I left Google, here's what I'm doing now, what do you think of it? Well, we'd like to have you back here again. Would you like to come back again? Sure. Well, why don't you do it? People even call it things like acqui-hires, right? This kind of combination of an acquisition and a hire. I mean, it's literally got its own sort of terminology. But that is this kind of porous, permeable membrane of talent flowing into and out of companies that sort of sparks innovation, but also sparks sort of the release of capital, right? Because I'm newly moneyed, I feel like I want to channel money back into the entrepreneurial marketplace, and I do. So that kind of networking is hugely important. So if you take it down a level from thinking in sort of economic terms or macroeconomic terms at the city level, take it down to the level of individual companies. That kind of networking drives so much of what happens and drives so much of why this region is different. It's another kind of mobility. Cities are unusual. Cities are unusual not just because there's this sort of nonlinear scaling in terms of economic output and innovation and other activities, because at their very core they accelerate. They accelerate in all kinds of unusual ways, including the speed at which the average person walks down the street. It's really fascinating. And you can push this quite far because there are a number of other parallels in terms of how cities operate and how cities work. Now, cities have some other characteristics, some of which are less attractive. Cities tend to be incredible producers of waste, and it's an area where we're constantly looking for ways to become much more efficient. And this will play back into innovation in some interesting ways in a second. This is from a New York City study looking at they did a full waste stream composition analysis for a single calendar year, looking at the entire waste stream of New York City in percentage terms, ranging from sort of durable goods and vehicle-related products like tires and personal items, diapers, containers, paper goods, miscellaneous products. It was really remarkable, but it's something we're constantly trying to economize around. What do we know about innovation? And this is sort of a map of innovation happening around the world in terms of interactions of researchers. One of the things we know about innovation is that innovation is driven by what? Innovation is driven by waste, right? I have no idea if this is going to work out, but I'm going to try 20 different experiments, right? It's not that I was sort of so smart, it's that I was willing to try and try and try. I'm willing to waste. I'm willing to take more at bats, take your favorite analogy, whichever metaphor you'd like to do. But the point is that so much of innovation only appears sort of straightforward and linear. It's actually a function of people having had many more tries, which in economic terms can look an awful lot like waste, right? I mean, why are you wasting so much time doing 6 startups, 5 of which failed? It feels wasteful, right? Why didn't you just take a job for $160,000 starting salary at Facebook and stay there instead? Well, it was a waste that made sense to me. It seemed a productive waste. Waste plays back into networks in some interesting ways. If you start take our metaphor back again, so think of the consequences in networks at the data link layer of waste. Well, one of the things that's happening is we're playing all of these real-time games online, right? And we play a lot of real-time games online. People come to rely on their ability to communicate quickly and interact and share, and that has some bizarre consequences, including this example I pulled up not too long ago from one of many real-time online games where someone was furious because they ran into a lag spike in a particular game, and they were furious because they had wasted hours of their game, and the lag time in the game was such that whenever they came back into the game, their character they had created had died. So there's sort of these frivolous problems that have to do with wasting bandwidth. But then there's sort of more economically productive examples. So these are the ways we're wasting bandwidth on a regular basis in North America right now. So these are the top applications in terms of their percentage usage of backbone networks right now, right? You can pretty much go across the board and sort of fill in your blank in terms of what you're doing, from social networking to web browsing and real-time entertainment. This is on a mobile front, so social networking is much larger than it would be if you were going from the desktop. But nevertheless, it's how we're spending our time. Does this all look productive to you? No, it looks highly unproductive, right? It's sort of magnificently unproductive, if you think about it. I mean, it's all kinds of things that people are doing, many of which we might characterize as being complete wastes of time, and yet out of those wastes of time flow all kinds of other interesting things. You might characterize something like Instagram as a waste, but it created some economic value that's getting cycled back in. Out of waste flows innovation, some of which we might like, some of which we might think are wasteful. So one of the things we track in the context of cities, networks, and innovation is bandwidth. So this is using, what was it, April data from Sandvine looking at bandwidth across countries around the world. And these are some of the top markets around the world in terms of highest average transfer rates you might see in terms of bandwidth in each of these cities. The main thing that I draw to your attention that I think is interesting, and we'll come back to why this is important, is that none of these cities, none of these countries you would probably characterize as entrepreneurial hotbeds, right? So that's interesting, right? So we'll sort of hold that and come back to it. Let's take it down a level. So that was at the level of countries. Most bandwidth in the world. We had our title list, our bandwidth leaders. Now let's take it down to the level of cities. So what cities sort of lead the world in terms of having the most bandwidth? We have the entrepreneurial hotbed of Vilnius, Lithuania, sitting at 3803. Take it all the way down. We're going down through more Lithuanian cities, Sofia, Bulgaria, Bucharest, Seoul, Kowloon, all the way down the line. Singapore, there's a couple here that we might think is sort of more entrepreneurial active. But what's really interesting is what's not here, right? What's not here are most of the cities we think of as being some of the most entrepreneurial hotbeds in the world. So we've told ourselves this story about the role of bandwidth and the role of waste and the role of innovation. Why is it this doesn't seem to play out this way? Let's take it down another level. So we were at the level of sort of global cities. Let's bring it into the US. These are the top states in terms of average bandwidth within those regions of the United States. New Jersey, that renowned entrepreneurial hotbed of the United States, simply exploding with bits. South Dakota, all lovely places, great places to go for more bandwidth, but none of them, again, what we might characterize as some of the most economically vibrant or certainly fastest entrepreneurially growing regions of the country, which is interesting. Let's take it down to the level of cities. Maybe finally we'll start seeing what we're expecting at the level of U.S. cities. Now we're at the level of U.S. cities and thinking about sort of networking and bandwidth and whether it's sparking innovation. Hey, there we go. We got Virginia Beach. Virginia Beach, Lawrenceville, Kansas, Bronx, Arlington, Virginia, Plano, Texas. There's nothing there, right? This is really striking. There's nothing there. All of these cities, about the only thing they have in common is this. They have this in common. They don't have anything else in common in terms of the vibrancy of the entrepreneurial community, their willingness to waste bits in the service of innovation. It's probably a problem because we're looking across too much of the country. So why don't we do this? Let's drill down one more level and go just into California, right? Because I bet what happens when you get inside of California, you know what's going to happen. It's going to be San Jose on the top of the list, right? Oh, no, it's not. It's Malibu. Malibu, Crescent City, Pismo Beach, lovely place. Calabasas, on down the list. Again, the main thing each of these cities seem to have in common is what? That they're on this list. They don't have anything else in common in terms of driving entrepreneurial activity. So this is really interesting to us at the Kauffman Foundation as we think about this thesis we have. But cities as economic units, cities as resorting mechanisms, cities as networks, and the importance of networks not just at the high level, but at the level of actual data transfer in terms of driving economic growth, and yet it's not borne out in the data that we see. So just as one last stab, just to see, what the heck is going on, I just for fun took it down one more level to say, let's take it down to the level of sort of cell phone coverage. And let's take it right down to this region right here, right in the center of Silicon Valley. And all of you, you know the punchline of this joke if you've spent any time in the Bay Area whatsoever, which is that Palo Alto area probably has the worst cell phone coverage in the developed world. There's whole stretches of Palo Alto where literally it's just like you can't get there from here from a bandwidth standpoint. So it has the point of this being that it has probably the lowest ratings of any region in the United States in terms of cell phone coverage of sort of major developed markets in the U.S. So it's really remarkable. What's most remarkable about this in the context of what I was trying to describe is this relationship between what we sort of hypothesized in terms of the role of cities we get, but we believe that there's also a role for waste, for thinking about these networks and our ability to waste bits in service of entrepreneurship, and it doesn't seem to show up. What's interesting is that waste shows up in lots of other areas, right? And I'll just sort of walk through one or two more, and I'll stop and take some questions if folks are interested. One of the things that's really interesting, and the U.S. gets beat up about this constantly, right, is that we're profligate wasters of energy. Incredibly inefficient, right? We hear this all the time, if the rest of the world used energy on the per capita basis that the United States did, we'd be in dire straits. That's undoubtedly true. Turn it around, however. One of the reasons why the U.S. arguably, and there's some wonderful new work coming out on this subject related to sort of energy intensity and entrepreneurship, one of the reasons why the U.S. has had this sort of remarkable economic growth is not just about mobility, but it's also been about our willingness to waste energy, to treat energy as if it was essentially limitless and free. Because what did that allow you to do? When something is limitless and free, what do? Whether it's bandwidth or energy. You experiment. You mess around. You do silly and indefensible things, right? You drive around on a Saturday just because you think you might like to. I leave a webcam running in my house, broadcasting in high def, just because, that's kind of interesting. It doesn't seem to cost me anything. I might as well do it, right? So when things are free, and this is sort of base economics, we tend to overuse the resource. But out of the overusage of that resource, what can flow? What can flow is experimentation. Much of that experimentation will look completely silly. It will look completely nonsensical. As a matter of fact, when I was talking about this recently to some of the Google folks in the context of the Google Fiber experiment, I said the most productive thing they can do as they drive Google Fiber out to all of these regions of the US is encourage people, literally celebrate as people waste data, do completely nonsensical things, celebrate everything that's not remote robotic surgery. Right? Find all of the nonsensical applications they can, because what do you really want to do? You want to convince people to cheaply experiment with all this bandwidth, because one of the only things we know about innovation is it's tied to wastage. And one of the reasons why, to bring this full circle, one of the reasons why these regions of the country don't seem to have a lot of bits flowing is because they've been so successful at wasting. It's not just that they didn't have the service delivered. Most of the regions of the country, of the United States, that have such terrible service have been remarkable at wasting what they have. And as a result, they've been able to experiment and come up with all sorts of interesting entrepreneurial experiments. So I want you to think about a couple of different things as I kind of wrap up. The role of cities, the role of waste in the context of experimentation with those cities, and how all of that ties back into sort of networks and economic growth. It's sort of a grand research program among many that we're sort of driving at Kauffman as we try to come up with entirely different lenses on how this magical thing called entrepreneurship and innovation. And I guess the way I'll close is to say, this is for us an example of coevolution, right? No different than honeybees and flowers. The way entrepreneurs respond to the resources of their cities, the way cities resort in response to the entrepreneurs that show up there. This is this coevolutionary process. It's not a convergent evolutionary process. There's no one solution, but it's the two of them acting in service of each other, evolving at exactly the same time, that produces these magical outcomes, some of the most magical in the world happening right here in the Bay Area. I'll stop here. I'm happy to take a couple of questions or run for it.